In this video, we're giving center stage to arguably the best chess player ever, Bobby Fischer, with 6 scintillating games in the highly aggressive King's Indian defense. The first opponent is Grandmaster Robert Byrne, and he starts d4. Fischer replies with knight f6, and white plays c4. Then Fischer plays g6, the King's Indian defense. The King's Indian defense is a hyper-modern opening, which means black deliberately allows white control of the center with pawns, with the plan of later challenging it. White goes for g3, looking to fianchetto his bishop as well, and black follows with c6, fighting back along the diagonal. After white's bishop to g2, black strikes in the center with d5. White takes the pawn, and black recaptures before white develops his knight to c3, building up pressure on black's d5. Fischer fianchettos his bishop on g7, and white pushes e3, solidifying his center. After black castles, white uses the vacated square to develop his knight without blocking his bishop. Black's knight to c6 is followed by white getting his king to safety too. Then black, seeing no real good square for his bishop along this diagonal, plays b6 with the idea of developing it the other direction. White takes inspiration from black's idea, playing b3, and both sides put their bishops on the a file where they peer at the enemy rooks. Black shifts his rook a square, whereas white lifts his queen to d2, looking to put his rook on d1 instead. With his rook in prime position, Fischer fires out e5 to break open the center. Now white could maintain the tension here, but black might even push the pawn another square, ending the fianchettoed bishop's whole career. So white takes the pawn, and black recaptures with the knight, getting a semi-open file for his rook. Then white proceeds with his plan of rook f to d1, piling up on black's lone pawn. But black shoves his knight right in the white queen's face onto d3. White chooses to shift his queen a square, threatening to get 2 pieces for the rook. Little to white's knowledge, black was setting a trap, and white ate up the bait, walking his queen right into trouble. Fischer feasts on the f2 pawn with his knight, which attacks white's rook. White doesn't have to take the knight, but he just give up a pawn for nothing. So he takes the knight, walking his king right into a fork fiesta. The king and pawn are under attack, so the king retreats before black grabs the pawn on e3, landing another fork on the queen, rook, and bishop. White sidesteps his queen, and Fischer's brilliance shines through with his next move. Instead of grabbing the rook, which would lead to a fairly even material exchange, black grabs the bishop instead, and white takes it back. What's happened is black just gave up a piece for 2 pawns, but in the process, he ripped open white's king side while getting rid of its most important defender, the light-squared bishop. Fischer follows with the only good move in this position, d4, hitting the knight while opening up the long diagonal, and after white takes the pawn with his knight, black drops his bishop to b7, where it snipes the enemy king. Now there's a cool tactic here. Were the king to go to g1, then black would take the knight on d4 with his bishop with check, and after the queen would recapture, black would jump his rook to e1, trying to deflect the rook away from the defense of the queen. White's best bet would be to dodge the check, after which black would take the queen, and once white would take it back, black would be able to win the rook in the corner. After all this, black would end up the exchange and a pawn. Back to the game. In light of this, white dodges the king to f1. Fischer lifts his queen, looking to jump it into h3, with what would be a dangerous check. White swings his queen over to f2, threatening discovered attacks on black's queen. But black was moving her anyway. She leaps to h3 with check, pushing the king to g1. At this point, black has a way to win the game, and the move is just a chef's kiss, so you have to give it a shot for yourself. Can you find black's winning move? In a wide open position, black's fianchettoed bishop pair dominate the board, while white's pieces are all stuck, doing way too much. The white queen must guard the g2 square from a checkmate, and the rook is hanging on to the knight. To exploit white's instability, the move Fischer plays is the brilliant rook e1 check. The queen can't take it because it would hang checkmate on g2, and the only other move would be to block the check. So white takes it with his rook, leaving his knight free to take by the black bishop, who then pins the white queen to its king. White's done for. Black's threat isn't even to take the queen, but to play queen to g2 checkmate, because the white queen is pinned. White could delay things with moves like knight to e4 or rook to e4, blocking the bishop's diagonal. But he just puts an end to his misery right away with queen takes d4, and how can you blame him? Fischer finishes the game up with checkmate on the board, queen g2. The next opponent is Jimmy Thomason, and he meets the King's Indian defense with knight to c3. After Fischer fianchettos his bishop, white takes full control over the center with e4. To stop white storming through, black plays d6. White follows with knight to f3, black castles, and white plays bishop to d3, preparing to do the same. Black's bishop to g4 pins the white knight to its queen, and once white castles, black hops his knight to c6, targeting the now undefended pawn on d4. White defends it with bishop to e3, and black drops his knight to d7, not only attacking it again, but making way for his f-pawn to advance. White drops his bishop to e2, opening his queen's eyes on the pawn, while also breaking the pin on his knight. Fischer captures the knight on f3, loosening white's grip over the e5 square, and after white recaptures, black pushes his pawn to that square. Now white could maintain the tension, or even take the pawn, but space is a good thing, and white plays d5, gaining it with a tempo. The knight is kicked back to e7, and white drops his bishop to e2, since it wasn't doing much on f3, staring at its own pawn, plus now the f-pawn can move. Black fires out f5, and white hits right back with f4. Now, it may have been more prudent to solidify his pawn structure with a move like f3, but f4 forces an opening of the center with more opportunities for winning tactics. Still, Fischer always backs himself in a tactical tussle, as he organizes his forces starting with h6 to guard the g5 square. White moves his bishop to d3, building the tension towards the center, and black remains patient with king to h7. After white lifts his queen to e2, black starts the skirmish with pawn takes e4. White takes back with his knight, and black jumps his knight to f5, attacking white's bishop. It drops to d2 before black fully opens the center after taking on f4. White recaptures with his bishop, and black leaps his knight to e5, hitting the other white bishop, who backs up to c2. As white retreats his forces, Fischer advances his, starting with knight to d4, hitting both the queen and the bishop. White shifts his queen a square, only to walk right into the other black knight's attack as it chomps down the pawn on c4. The white queen flees to f2, but her suffering won't end there. Black has a marvelous move here to win the game. Can you find black's winning idea? To spot the winning combination, you might notice that were the knight to land on e2, it would fork the king and whatever piece is on the f4 square. As of now, white's queen guards e2, but there's a way to lure her away. The move Fischer plays to set it all up is the remarkable rook takes f4. Now white doesn't have to take back, but black just got a full bishop. So white recaptures with the queen, walking her right into a royal fork with knight to e2. After the king dodges to the corner, black grabs the queen on f4, going up a decisive amount of material, and white decides, rightfully so, that it's time to resign the game. The third opponent is the first ever Indian chess master Manuel Aaron, and he meets the King's Indian defense with knight to c3. After Fischer fianchettos his bishop, white pushes ahead with e4. Black stops further advances with d6, and white plays f3, solidifying his center, while stopping black's knight from jumping to g4 so that white can safely house his bishop on e3. Black castles and white plays bishop to e3, while black develops his knight from b to d7. Then white lifts his queen to d2, creating a battery aimed at black's kingside, while giving himself the option to castle queenside, which would make for a sharp game. Fischer expands on the queenside with c5, and white maintains the tension, developing his knight from g to e2. Black's a6 defends b5 with the idea of pushing up his pawn there, and white advances his knight to g3. Black clarifies the central situation with a pawn capture, and white takes back with the bishop. Then black jumps his knight to e5. Now white has a space advantage, so he avoids exchanging pieces, instead developing his final minor piece with bishop to e2. Black brings his bishop out to e6, building up pressure on white's c-pawn. So white blocks the attack with knight to d5. Fischer undermines the white knight's powerful post with b5. This gives up a pawn, however, because white can take, and after black recaptures, he can take it with his bishop. But the white knight has one less defender, so black can win the pawn back by taking twice on d5. Now black has two central pawns to white's 0, which gives black an advantage in the center. But were we to get to an endgame, white's passed pawns on the queen side could be difficult for black to deal with. Now it looks like white can win a piece by taking the knight, opening the queen's attack on black's bishop, but black can take back with the pawn, opening his queen's defense. So going back, white instead starts the push with a4, which also fastens his bishop into place. And after black prudently defends his own bishop with e6, white castles. Fischer hurriedly hauls his queen to h4 with the threat of sacrificing his knight on f3 with check, which would open his bishop's attack on white's bishop to win the piece back. White sees this, dropping his knight to e2 to add a defender to his bishop, and black activates his rook, moving it over from f to c8. White drops his bishop to e3, threatening to trap the black queen with bishop to g5, since were she to go to h5, then the white knight would chase her down on g3. Black counters with knight to c4, hitting white's queen, and after white takes it with his bishop, black recaptures with his queen, getting her out of danger. White attacks the queen with rook to c1, and she drops to a6 before white takes the rook and black recaptures. Then white jumps his knight to c3. Fischer lifts his bishop to c4, making way for his pawn to advance, and white plays f4. Black pushes his pawn to d5, and white puts his bishop in front of it while offering an exchange. Black takes the bishop, and white recaptures with the queen. Black drops his queen to b7, attacking the b-pawn, so white drops his queen to f2 to defend, even though she was really well placed in the center. Black moves his bishop backwards to a6, opening up his rook's eyes. After white slides his rook over to the center, black lifts his rook to c4, building up pressure on two of white's pawns. White lifts his rook to d2, relieving his queen's responsibility for the b-pawn. But this last move was a monumental mistake. Black has a move here that wins the game on the spot. Can you find black's best move? The reason white's position is in a predicament is that his back rank is undefended, let alone the fact that black's bishop is perfectly placed. To exploit this, the move Fischer plays is the brilliant rook takes c3, and white immediately resigns. Black just won a full piece, which is decisive on its own, and were white to take the rook, then white would lose the whole game instead. Black's checkmate in 3 would start with queen to b1, and white can't block with the queen because of black's bishop, so he would have to delay things, but black would eventually finish up the game with checkmate. Next on the hit list is Karl Berger, and against the King's Indian defense, he builds up a big center which Fischer doesn't allow any further with d6 before white plays f3, solidifying his center. Black contests it right away with e5, and white defends his pawn with knight g to e2. After black castles his king to safety, white brings his bishop to e3. Black's c6 plans to break white's bind over the center with the d5 pawn break. White lifts his queen to d2, and black takes the pawn on d4. Once white takes back with the knight, black pushes d5. White takes once, and after the recapture, he pushes e5, hitting black's knight. Fischer drops it to e8, staying out of the way of his queen's defense of the pawn. The bishop is also attacking e5, so white plays f4 to defend it, before black pushes f6, challenging white's center. White's knight d to b5 opens the queen's eyes to put additional pressure on d5. Black ignores this, taking on e5, and white takes on d5 with his queen, giving check. Black exchanges queens, and white takes back with the knight, threatening both knight to e7 check, which would win the bishop, and knight to c7, which would eventually win the rook in the corner. So black plays knight to c6, defending e7 and giving his rook some air, before white plays bishop to c5, hitting black's rook. Fischer dodges his rook to f7, and white plays bishop c4, threatening to move the knight, opening a pin on the rook to the king. So black blocks the diagonal with bishop to e6, and white finally castles. Black's knight to a5 hits the bishop, and white defends it with b3 before black takes it. White takes back, and black plays b6, kicking the other bishop back to b4. Black takes the knight on d5, giving white a weak isolated pawn after he recaptures. Then black takes on f4, securing a pawn advantage. White swings his rook over from a to e1, hitting black's knight, so that even though black plays rook to d8 next, attacking white's pawn, he can't take it without hanging his knight. White lifts his rook to e4, doubling up on black's f-pawn, and black counters with a6, hitting the knight, who jumps back to d4. Now Fischer gradually built his advantage in this game with a pawn, and soon another one. He plays knight to f6, hitting the rook, who takes on f4, winning back the pawn. And white might be able to wiggle his way back into this game, if not for one move by black that wins the game on the spot. Can you find black's winning move? Now it looks like black's knight is pinned to the rook, but white's knight is only defended by the white rook while being indirectly attacked by the bishop. With a quick calculation, Fischer finds a way to win material, and it starts with the move knight takes d5, which also attacks the white bishop. Were white to take the rook, then black would take the knight with check, and once the king would move, he would take the bishop as well. Black would get two pieces for the rook, in addition to the pawn which he just won on d5, giving him a decisive material advantage, especially in an endgame. Back to the game. Instead of this, white actually plays knight to e6, attacking black's rook. But Fischer takes the white rook, and white, realizing he missed an important detail in the position, resigns the game. Were white to follow through with his plan, which was taking the rook, then black's knight to e2 would force the white king into the corner because of the black rook's fervent glare down the f-file. Then black would take the rook with checkmate. Going back, white's best choice here is to take the knight back, which would result in black being up the exchange and the pawn, which is more than enough for Fischer to win this game. The penultimate opponent is chess great Viktor Korchnoi, and he creates a big center before meeting black's d6 with bishop to e2, starting to develop his kingside minor pieces. After Fischer castles, white plays knight to f3, ready to get his king to safety. Black breaks with e5 and white castles before black plays knight to c6, building up pressure on white's d4 point. White advances the pawn, gaining space, while kicking the knight back to e7. Then white drops his knight to d2, looking to reroute it towards the queenside while making way for his f-pawn to advance. Black doesn't want white to play c5 anytime soon, so he plays it for himself. And white doesn't want to give up his space advantage, so he doesn't take en passant, instead playing a3 to build up a queenside push. Fischer methodically drops his knight to e8, paving the lane for an f-pawn break. But first, white breaks with b4. So black plays b6, maintaining the tension. White shifts his rook to b1, ready for an opening of the b-file, before black fires out f5. Now white doesn't want to take the pawn because he would give up a valuable central pawn, and black would recapture with the f-pawn with a powerful and unopposed pawn duo on the king side. So white plays f3, maintaining the tension, before black pushes f4, gaining substantial kingside space. White expands on the queen side with a4, and black keeps going with g5. While white presses on with a5. Fischer lifts his rook, preparing to swing it over to either the g or the h file, and black takes on c5, opening the b file as black recaptures. After this sequence, white's pawn on a5 is under attack, so he lifts his knight to b3 to defend it, while black shifts his rook a square, preparing another pawn break on g4. White finally develops his final minor piece with bishop to d2, and black reactivates his knight onto f6. White fearfully flees his king to the corner, and black pushes g4. White can't allow g3, because although white might be able to close things up with h3, black would surely sacrifice on h3 at some point, with a devastating attack to follow. So white takes the pawn. Fischer recaptures with his knight, getting another piece close to the enemy king, and white lifts his rook to f3, trying to add defenders nearby. After black shifts his rook to h6, adding a second attacker to the h2 pawn, white pushes it to h3. The pawn is pinned, however, so black doesn't need to move his knight, as he moves his other one to g6, looking to jump it further forward. White moves his king out of the pin, which means black's knight is under attack, so it returns to f6. Now black's other knight is going to jump to h4, and were it to get there, things would get dangerous for white with moves like rook to g6, or even a knight sacrifice on g2 coming. So white plays bishop to e1, prepared to chop off the knight if necessary. At this point, Fischer notices that white doesn't have a good way to make progress, or to make any threats, and in light of this, he comes up with a slow, yet powerful plan. He starts with knight to h8, with a maneuver to g5 in mind. White moves his rook away from the f3 square, and after black's knight to f2, he slots his bishop into the vacated square. Black jumps his knight to g5, attacking critical squares near the enemy king. And after white lifts his queen to e2, bringing in reinforcements, black shifts his rook to g6, threatening to take on h3, since the g-pawn would be pinned to the king. To avoid this, white shifts his king to f1, but really, black's attack has just become too strong. In this position, black has a clever move that will build a considerable advantage. Can you find black's best move? Most of white's pieces are on the queen side, while the rest of them form a wall, entrapping their own king. Meanwhile, black's pieces are all aiming at the king's side. Fischer spots a tactic to win material, and the move he plays is knight takes h3. This brilliant move wins a pawn, and with black's already dominant position, it's definitely enough for black to win the game in most cases. White would do best by leaving the knight alone, while trying to consolidate his position with a move like bishop to h4, opening a lane for his king to run away. Instead, he takes the knight, asking black to prove his sacrifice's soundness. This is no problem for Fischer, as he grabs the pawn with his bishop while giving check, and with black's rook dominating the open g-file, the white king's only choice is f2. Black jumps his knight to g4, checking again, and after white takes it with his bishop, black recaptures with his bishop, with an attack on the white queen. At this point, white realizes that there just isn't a good way out of this mess, and he resigns the game. He's going to have to move his queen, and it doesn't really matter where. If she runs towards the queen side, then black would swoop in with queen to h4, check, pushing the king to f1. Queen to h1 would force him to f2, where he would get pushed right back to f1 after queen to h2. Then bishop to h3 check would force white to take the bishop, and black would finish things up with rook g1 checkmate. Going back, even if white were to keep his queen nearby, putting her on f1 instead, black would still play queen h4 check. The king would be forced towards the g-file, and g2 is the better of the two squares. Black would follow with bishop e2 with a discovered check by his rook, and white would be forced to block the check. After this, white would just lose a whole bunch of material, including the queen, justifying his resignation. The final opponent is Rennes Letellier, and against the king's Indian defense, he builds up a big center. This time, Fischer, unafraid, castles his king, allowing white to storm through with e4, hitting the knight, who calmly drops back to e8 before white solidifies his advanced pawn with f4. Fischer meticulously begins his counterpush with d6. White does not want to take the pawn, as it would just help black break free from his bind. So he develops his bishop to e3. Black proceeds pounding on white's center with c5. This time, white does not want to let black take the pawn, as it would just help his knight develop with a tempo. So white captures on c5, and black ignores it, developing his knight. White captures on d6 again, black recaptures, and white prudently avoids another capture. He realizes that if he accepted black's pawn sacrifice, the knight would be developed, the bishop's eyes would be opened, and the rook would be quick to occupy the e-file, where white's king would be shivering with fear. So, he instead moves his knight to e4, attacking the d6 pawn. Fischer craftily spots bishop f5, hitting the knight and opening the lane for his rook. Now white could capture several times on d6, but black would avoid the queen exchange, then soon slide his rook over with the tempo before breaking open the center with f6. In this position, black would be down a pawn, but his pieces would be primed for the attack. Going back, instead of this, white drops the knight to g3, hitting the bishop, who retreats to e6. White develops his knight to f3, and black moves his queen to c7, where it indirectly adds an attacker to e5, and opens the d8 square for his rook. White replies with queen b1, getting off the d-file, and aiming to support an f5 pawn break. Fischer finally breaks the tension in the center, capturing on e5. Then white pushes f5, hitting the bishop. Now black could take the pawn, but instead he pushes e4, hitting the knight. White takes the bishop with his pawn, and black takes white's knight. Now white does not want to take on f7 with check, because the queen would recapture, creating a brutal battery down the f-file. So he recaptures on f3, and black follows with f5, fighting for key central squares, and threatening a fork on f4. White plays f4 himself to stop this. Fischer quickly begins employing his troops with knight to f6, looking to maneuver forward. White develops his bishop to e2, covering the g4 square, and black shifts his rook to e8, attacking the indefensible e6 pawn. Now white could castle here, but the g-file is semi-open, so he chooses king f2 instead to get his king to safety, since it also defends the bishop, which gets attacked after black's next move, rook takes e6. White uses this extra time that he saved to move his rook over to fight for the e-file. Fischer puts the last piece of the puzzle into place with rook a to e8, and now every warrior is ready. The bishop is attacked, so white moves the other bishop to f3, opening his rook's defense. Black sacrifices the exchange, capturing on e3. White recaptures, leading to an exchange of rooks, and the king landing on e3. The next move is the masterstroke of Fischer's brilliant idea. Can you find what black plays next? If you were able to find this one, then give yourself a pat on the back. The only winning move, and the one that Fischer plays, is queen takes f4 check. White has a glance at the sacrificed queen and ponders for a little while before ultimately throwing in the towel, resigning the game. The queen also hits the bishop, so the king must stay close by, otherwise black would just take the bishop. The king going to e2 runs into knight d4 with a fork that would win the full bishop. The king going to f2 would put up a little more resistance, but black would just play knight to g4 check, exploiting the pin on the bishop. Then after the king would move to g2, knight to e3 check not only forces him back to f2, it stops the white queen from going to d1 to defend the bishop. Black would follow with knight d4, attacking the indefensible pinned bishop. Going back, needless to say, Fischer, and you as well, if you saw this move, also saw that if the king took the offered queen, then bishop to h6 would be a picturesque checkmate. I hope these games were both entertaining and instructive. Use my link in the description when purchasing a chess.com membership, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chess content.